but I am located in, okay. I am located in Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm on the west coast of Newfoundland, even though our head office is in Vancouver. So a lot of times people think I'm in BC or from BC, but I'm from the East Coast, just like many of you, which is why I was happy to have something in my own time zone for once and not have to do BC time. Prior to working for ITAC, I did work for my own First Nation in tourism development for about 6 years. My First Nation is Halibu First Nation, which is a Mi'kmaq First Nation on throughout central and west coast of Newfoundland. We are a landless band with almost 24,000 members, so one of the largest single First Nations in Canada. And I did a lot of work within the province with the Newfoundland and Labrador Indigenous Tourism Association. I helped to incorporate that association and sat as their inaugural chair for a few years before moving on to the national level. And I was able to collaborate with GMIST and do a lot of great work when I worked with my First Nation and worked in the province. We actually developed an Indigenous tourism training program and did a lot of things within the park with our tourism operators. So I'm really happy to be back with GMIST today to present to all of you. There's some familiar faces in the crowd, so I'm really happy to see you, and I'm really happy to see all the new faces and spend some time with you today. So I'm going to present maybe just for 20 minutes or so. We'll see how long it goes. Just keeping it, I didn't want it to be too corporate. I really just wanted to get to the fundamentals and the philosophies behind what is Indigenous tourism and how do we all work together to be inclusive in Indigenous tourism and to help the industry grow. And then, but what I'm really excited to answer questions and to have discussion afterwards. So I wanted to make sure we had some time left for that. So without further ado, I'm going to just try to share here. Okay, so I'm going to go to, everyone see my screen now? I'm just trying to move the bar here so I can start my slideshow. Okay, so everyone see the first slide here? Just want to make sure it's working. Nora's nodding her head, so okay. Okay, so Indigenous tourism, reconciliation, and action. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means as we go through the presentation. But this is one of the philosophies that we really stand by at the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada, which I'll refer to as ITAC, and really a point that we want to bring across to our partners, to other industry operators, and really the whole world is, why is it so important that Indigenous tourism, that we facilitate Indigenous tourism, that we stimulate it to give people a vessel to tell their stories. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But first of all, just to introduce you to ITAC and who we are. We are a national nonprofit organization. We're industry focused and industry led. So we're governed by a board of 13 elected members. So that's one representative, an industry representative from every region across Canada, the provinces and the territories. And we are a membership-based organization where our membership is comprised of Indigenous tourism operators. Those are our voting members. You can also be a member of ITAC as an industry partner, as non-voting. And if you're a non-Indigenous operator, you can also be a non-voting member and just stay up to date with things that we're offering and join our conferences and things like that. So our mission and our vision. So our mission is to provide leadership in the development and marketing of authentic Indigenous tourism experiences through innovative partnerships. So I like to give props to our PR team for this mission because it includes all 4 of our pillars that we base all of our work on, which is leadership, development, marketing, and partnerships. That's really the 4 avenues that we work on to grow the Indigenous tourism industry within Canada. So we do a lot of advocacy work on the government level and provide leadership to our provincial and territorial Indigenous tourism partners within the regions. We do a lot of development work with our members and our operators, offering them resources such as training tools, things like that. And we just launched our new accreditation program, which is really, which I'll touch on a little bit later, but really provides us with a vessel to promote and work with our authentic business owners to get them to the next level of market readiness. We have an award-winning marketing team. We market domestically, we market internationally. We have a great partnership with Destination Canada, and we do a lot of market research as well. And then we take all of our market ready operators, we market them within those markets across the globe. And then partnerships. We have partnerships with most of the national industry associations, such as Tourism HR Canada, the Tourism Industry Association of Canada, and partnerships all throughout the country. And our vision, of course, is a thriving Indigenous tourism economy, sharing authentic, memorable, and enriching experiences. And you'll see that word authentic throughout this entire presentation, because it's really the most important key to us developing Indigenous tourism within Canada. So a little bit about the industry, and this is really my only corporate slide with numbers, so don't be alarmed, but just a little snapshot of what the industry is, or where the industry is in Canada. So we have some 2019 numbers here, because of course that was pre-pandemic, before everything kind of, I don't need to talk about the pandemic to you, tourism professionals, but in 2019, across Canada, we employed 39,000 employees, and our contribution to direct GDP was 1.9 billion. We did measure the growth within the tourism industry over the couple of years before 2019. So Indigenous tourism did increase almost by 24% up till 2019, which outpaced the growth in the whole tourism industry in Canada. So it really showed that really showed the interest in Indigenous tourism that we had here in the country. So then, of course, the pandemic came, and we saw almost a 66% decline in our direct GDP, 60% decline in employment. And you know, we're not alone in that. I know that was really an industry-wide thing that happened. But our post-pandemic research has shown that we, as Indigenous tourism industry is expected to recover more quickly than the rest of the tourism sector by 2025. And the pandemic has really changed the way that people want to travel. And that has led to growing enthusiasm for Indigenous tourism. So we have really, it has amplified the curiosity. I think a lot of the experiences that we offer really coincide with what people are wanting in terms of an experience post-pandemic. So that's good news for us. So we're now looking at our next 5-year strategy to take us to 2030. And our goal is actually to be the top Indigenous tourism destination in the world, surpassing New Zealand by 2030. So the 3 main priorities that we have at ITAC is, of course, inspiring our member businesses. So our member businesses and our operators on the ground are the foundation of everything that we do, and providing them support to rebuild, refocus, but then grow bigger and better than they ever were before. Our second main priority, as I mentioned, is working with our provincial and territorial Indigenous tourism associations. So you guys are from different provinces, so I don't know if you're aware of the organizations that are in your province. In Newfoundland and Labrador, it's the Newfoundland and Labrador Indigenous Tourism Association. In New Brunswick, there is the Indigenous Tourism Association of New Brunswick. PEI, there's Indigenous Tourism Association of PEI. So I can connect you after this presentation with those regional Indigenous tourism associations, if that's something that you would like, because we try to facilitate those provincial connections, and they're really doing great work on the ground, and we just nationally try to help facilitate and stimulate them. And then, of course, our third priority is strengthening us as a national leader and advocate for Indigenous tourism. Like I said, we do a lot of advocacy work in the federal government level, and we're always advocating for funding into the industry that we can then disperse to our regions and then disperse to our businesses. So I do have a video here now. I'm not sure if my sound will come through, because I always feel like there's something extra special you have to do for sound, but just let me know, Nora, because I can see you, if the sound's working or not. Okay, let me just hit play here. Do we have sound? Okay. Okay, well, I'll leave it till the end, because I know in order to do sound, I need to get out of it, press a button, and then come back. So I promise you I'll show the video later. I just need to get to the next slide here now. Okay. Why is it not going to the next slide? There we go. Okay. No, there. Okay. So that was a little bit about ITAC, but what I really want to talk about is what is Indigenous tourism, what is it all about, and what are the important aspects of Indigenous tourism that if we're partnering, if we're collaborating, that we can't forget when we're working together. So like I said, authenticity is really, without authenticity, Indigenous tourism just doesn't work. So authenticity is the heart of Indigenous tourism. And okay. So what does authenticity mean? If we have culture within Indigenous tourism, and as you'll see a couple slides later, Indigenous tourism sometimes can be Indigenous cultural experiences or cultural tourism, but us at ITAC and what we consider Indigenous tourism sometimes may not have any culture embedded in it. It's any Indigenous majority owned or majority Indigenous owned business. So anything 51% owned by an Indigenous person or more. That's what we consider Indigenous tourism, and that's what that's who we help as our operators. But any Indigenous tourism operation, or if we're even partnering with, if you're the business and you're not Indigenous, but you're partnering with, an Indigenous tour operator or anyone giving an experience, the culture belongs to the community. So we need to make sure that whatever culture is being represented is respectful to the community that person belongs to, that protocols are not being breached. Every community has different protocols. Every community has different aspects of culture. So there's no real guidebook on what this means, as every community is different, what you can share, what you can't share. But that's why community connection and making sure the culture is coming from the right places is so important. So why does it then authenticity matter? What happens if you have a product that isn't authentic? What does that mean? So this is what we like to say: Indigenous tourism is by Indigenous peoples, not about Indigenous peoples. And this is a good slogan, I guess, not even just for the tourism industry, but for education, for anything that's really providing information about Indigenous people to an audience. I know even myself growing up as a Mi'kmaq person, I can remember learning about Mi'kmaq people in school. And there was no mention of like the living culture or the Indigenous people that still existed. It was very much historical, but a colonial historic account of what Mi'kmaq people were. And I was a Mi'kmaq person learning about this in school. So we try to encourage living culture that if there's any Indigenous representation or any information about Indigenous people, even if they're not present, that it comes from the community, that it comes from Indigenous people, and it's not just, from historic textbook or something colonial like that, because we're trying to change the narrative. We're trying to make sure that what we offer is from an Indigenous perspective. So we're not talking about Indigenous people. We're learning about Indigenous people from their own perspective and their own stories. So that is one of the most important aspects of Indigenous tourism, is that they are in control, or we are in control of our own stories. So what that means to the visitor, and the visitor will know the difference if it's, something is advertising themselves as an Indigenous experience, or you have Indigenous information available at your operation. What they want is not just, to walk into a museum and have that historical account. Visitors today want a connection. We all have heard about experiential tourism, and that, the living connection, like to experience something. Well, that's what a visitor wants when they're engaging in an Indigenous tourism experience. And they will know if it's not authentic, and then they'll lose faith in the Indigenous tourism industry. They want unique experiences, so they want to experience something in a community that they can't anywhere else. And that's what Indigenous tourism gives them. And they want personal perspectives. So like I said, it goes back to seeing what we see, and I keep saying that, but that was for Experience Halibu when I worked for my First Nation. That was kind of our tagline, is Experience Halibu, see what we see. So this is the visitor engaging with people that can give them new perspectives on the land uses, the culture around them, and a different way to see the world, because the Indigenous way to see the world it's not colonial. It's not the same as other cultures. So that's what we really want to convey and get across. So Indigenous tourism protocols. And so I get my mouse back here. So like I said, and it needs to be 51% Indigenous owned and controlled in order to be considered an Indigenous tourism operation. That's really the national standard for what Indigenous tourism is. And if there's any sometimes, we have investments from non-Indigenous companies and things like that, but the Indigenous elements still had to be controlled and verified by Indigenous people. Again, knowledge from the keepers. So going back to the community connection, the culture comes from the knowledge keepers and the elders, not from a textbook. And Indigenous content is led by Indigenous people, which is a really important point if we're talking about partnering with Indigenous communities or other Indigenous operators. If there's any Indigenous content, it needs to be led by Indigenous people. So if you want to, start foraging from a Mi'kmaq lens in your operation, or you want to lead a medicine walk, or any kind of Indigenous element that you want to bring to your business, and you're not an Indigenous person, that's something that can be done, but it needs to be a mutually beneficial partnership. And you need to make sure that those elements are not just, you getting a little bit of information from an Indigenous person and then taking it on your own and kind of conveying that then as an Indigenous experience, but that the content and is led by Indigenous people holistically and meaningfully. So protecting culture while supporting community. And this is one thing that I always talked about when I worked for my community, is Indigenous tourism. Sometimes there were people that really didn't understand what Indigenous tourism was and kind of seen it as you're selling out culture, you're selling culture, and that's not right. It's something that should be protected and just for us. But what Indigenous tourism does is it protects culture while supporting the community. So it gives us protocols and processes for really looking at culture in a way that we probably didn't before. What can be shared? What don't we want to share? What's sacred? What's ceremony? And then it's also giving the youth within a community a reason and motivation to learn their culture, because this gives them a way that they can use their culture to be economically stable, and to share with others, and then it kind of keeps it alive. So I like to say that Indigenous tourism is not just about the economic benefit, but it's also about the social benefits to an Indigenous community and the cultural benefits of making culture sustainable and making it last, because it gives a vessel to carry it from generation to generation. Again, connecting with elders, and what we see is Indigenous tourism, or even more broadly with Indigenous artwork and crafts being so I guess commonplace now, or I guess sought after, and that being a big element of Indigenous tourism. It gives a reason for younger generations to connect with their elders, because that wasn't always happening. There was no reason to learn from knowledge keepers or elders in other industries, but this really gives us that transgenerational connection, and again, the cultural preservation. And it creates a positive economy. Protect sacred places. So this is another benefit, I guess, of Indigenous tourism, where if it's an experience that takes people out on the land and again shows people that perspective of an Indigenous person, we're almost facilitating environmental stewards, learning or teaching people to respect nature in a different way, in a very Indigenous way, and then that leads to environmental sustainability. At ITAC, we also focus on the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and we're currently working on creating a sustainability strategy, not just for us as an organization, but tools for our businesses, how they can incorporate SDGs and sustainable practices within their businesses, and then facilitate that out to the visitor as well. So to bring it back to reconciliation and action, which I kind of stated throughout, but to kind of bring it all home, in experiencing Indigenous tourism firsthand is an important way for non-Indigenous Canadians to gain a new perspective, or partnering with Indigenous tourism operators can help others in the industry gain that same perspective. It helps connect to the lands in a very holistic, wholesome way, traditions and way of life of Indigenous people, and it's really changing the narrative of what people know and think of Indigenous populations and communities within Canada, and letting Indigenous people have a way to carry their own stories, whether it's, the very horrific things that have happened to them in history being told from their perspective, but also giving them a way to present their very vibrant, colorful cultures in a welcoming, non-intimidating way, and having people really understand who they are, all while this beneficially impacts the economic growth within the communities. So investing in Indigenous tourism creates and expands tourism economic development projects with Indigenous nations, which supports self-determination for Indigenous businesses. So, there's many different sectors that are working on self-determination for Indigenous businesses. One good thing about Indigenous tourism is we see this on the individual operator level, but it's really awesome when you see an Indigenous community look at tourism development from a community level and how they can facilitate it and develop it for their entire community, which again, helps with cultural preservation, and then helps that community have a revenue that can then and then that can support other things within the community. For some stats, 33% of Indigenous tourism businesses are owned by women entrepreneurs, and that is more than double of the percentage of non-Indigenous tourism businesses. So we have a high number of women entrepreneurs. We're actually doing a study right now in the North. It's called the Northern Women Entrepreneurs Study with what used to be Ryerson University, which is now Toronto Metropolitan University, where we're engaging with 50 Northern women entrepreneurs on what they need to be successful, all Indigenous, what they need to be successful entrepreneurs in the North, and gaining those perspectives is just so enlightening. I've sat in on some of the circles, and really digging into different community members and knowing what they need and what their perspective on Indigenous tourism is just so helpful and so great for us to shape our resources and our tools. We also employ a higher percentage of Indigenous workers in our sector than any other sector, like Indigenous sector industry. So like if in our like oil and gas or forestry or anything like that, we actually within Indigenous tourism employ over half of our employees are Indigenous. So that's 4 times higher than any other sector. So fisheries, whatever other sectors there are that Indigenous communities are focused on, Indigenous tourism is who creates the most jobs for our people. So when we look at partnering, we just have to remember that the partnership has to be meaningful. If you want to partner with an Indigenous, if you want an Indigenous element within your operation and partner with the Indigenous community that you're close by, just be open to what that's going to look like, because your perspective on what that should be is probably not the culture or the experience that needs to be shared. I can remember working with partners early on in my career and marketing partners. And we talked about, marketing Indigenous tourism and what that looks like. And they said, well, the Western, I'm sorry, my dog's snoring. I don't know if you can hear her, but, when people think of Indigenous tourism, what they want is, they want headdresses with feathers and they want drums and they need to see people in regalia, because that's what people think Indigenous tourism is. So that was an expectation that they had of what Indigenous tourism is, but that's not what everyone's culture is. That's not what it's not Pocahontas. It's not, the Wild Wild West. It looks very different in every community. And that's just some, I guess, Western views of what Indigenous tourism is. So you need to be open to learn what it actually means, what the culture is, what Indigenous tourism is in your area, and then commit to sharing that in a very real, holistic way. I know there was another person that had contacted me a couple of years ago in the province. With I guess Mi'kmaq culture is what they wanted to really present, being in Newfoundland and Labrador, and they had a tree that had fallen on their property. So they thought that a good idea would be to let's just erect it and get a totem pole made. And that was going to be like their representation of Indigenous culture. But they contacted me, which was the right thing to do, because I was representing my community at the time. And then I was able to tell them, as Mi'kmaq people are not totem pole people, and we don't, that's not a part of our culture. That's really a Western, like West Coast Canada part of Indigenous culture. So that's what I mean by saying it's different everywhere, and you wouldn't want to be misrepresenting the Indigenous people within your area. So that's a example of if you're not engaging with the Indigenous community and the right people, that you can really misrepresent who they are. Know what you bring to the partnership. Everyone needs to have to know what they're responsible for. Everyone needs to know what they're benefiting. It needs to be mutually beneficial. You can't call yourself an Indigenous tourism operation just because you have one Mi'kmaq tour or Indigenous tour that is or an experience that's happening on your property. You have to make sure you're presenting that in the correct way, where you're really providing a venue for that experience to happen. And always, as always, and kind of a theme throughout my presentation, understand Indigenous are in control of their own story. That's how reconciliation happens, and that's why we feel that Indigenous tourism is so important for our communities, and respect the autonomy of Indigenous experience being shared. That like that marketing person thought what it should be, or they thought they knew what it should be with the drums and the regalia and everything, but that's not authenticity, and that's maybe not what it should be. And I will say, I don't have it in this presentation, but in July, we launched an accreditation program with ITAC called the Original Accreditation Program. And it's really a great tool, especially I know we have some economic development people on this call today, because I know that one of the hardest things could be knowing who your Indigenous tourism operators are in your area. When you want to work with them as an industry partner or an economic development partner. And what our accreditation program allows is we get people to go through the accreditation program, and we assess them, and then we accredit them, and they can promote themselves as the original. We promote them as an original, and that gives you a avenue to know who is authentic and who the real Indigenous tourism operators are. Because it happens out there, we see it all the time right across the country, is there are non-Indigenous operators out there that do claim to be Indigenous, that try to get that marketing, to try to get the promotion of being an Indigenous operator, but they are not Indigenous. So this is really a way that we vet the authenticity of Indigenous tourism operators, and then share the program with everyone else. And so then you are aware, and you know you're working with the right people. So I guess that's another presentation for another time. And I guess the last thing to leave you with is nothing about us without us. So, and this is, we don't see this as much anymore. We're trying to change this, but a lot of times cultural centers, museums, historic sites would have the stories of Indigenous people, but there was no living culture, and it wasn't the story told in the Indigenous perspective. And that's when partnering, when engaging, that is the most important thing to remember, is nothing about us without us. So that engagement and collaboration is key to everything. So that is the end of my presentation. We don't have as much, we have about 15 minutes, I guess, for questions. I can stay on a little bit longer if
Were you going to show your video there, Tara?
Oh, yes. Okay. I'm going to try, because I know, yeah, share sound. See, you need to click it on the bottom for everyone who wants to share video on Zoom. It's a little box, share sound. So I will share it now. Thank you for the reminder, though. I'm just going to find it here. And oh, that's not where I needed to be. I'll just go back this way.
It's great information, Tara. Thank you very much.
Oh, no problem. Oh my goodness, my mouse keeps disappearing. Okay, almost there. Here we go. Now, let me know if you hear it this time.
Yep.
Aha, there you go.
We have a story to tell. it's an opportunity for us to share our culture, about who we really are. Across Canada, there's a vibrant Indigenous history. It's the heritage of our country. Communities who are sharing their culture as storytellers of a continuous tradition. Inviting you to live experiences that reconnect you to the land, to your spirit. Step into the dance, join the beat of the drum, and feel the earth's heartbeat, a sound that will last forever.
Okay, there you go. Yeah,
Thank
that's just one
you.
of our little PSAs.
That was really nice. Thank you. Now, does anyone have any questions for Tara?
Yes, I do, and I don't know what the hand sign is. I have tried to work with our Mi'kmaq community years ago when we introduced Starlight, Dark Skies.
Mhm.
I couldn't get anything done on a timeline for opening, and so I worked with Métis, and it was a beautiful, beautiful ceremonies. But I'm really, really confused about working with Métis groups versus Mi'kmaq. And I'm Canadian, but I'm new Canadian, so
Okay.
apologies for the question. But would it be, could I work with Métis as putting forward Indigenous culture?
Oh, yes, that's a very good question. But yes, you definitely can. So our definition of Indigenous includes First Nations, which would be Mi'kmaq, or, there's many different First Nations across Canada, Métis, or Inuit. So those are the three categories that all fall under Indigenous. So we very much promote and work with Métis communities all across Canada. And if there's usually what we find, if you're working in a place where there's more than one First Nation, it's not wrong, or Indigenous group, I should say, it's not wrong to work with all of them. So even if you were working with Mi'kmaq and developing something with them, you could still work with Métis as well. I wouldn't exclude anyone, but Métis definitely.
I had no choice. I had no choice.
Yeah, I know. Sometimes you can't facilitate these partnerships.
And I don't know how to properly engage. I try my best. I'm pretty good,
Yeah.
right? And I was like familiar with Navajo culture, right? Like friends who are Navajo, but I'm not. The Mi'kmaq is kind of, it's a different world.
Yeah, and sometimes it is hard to navigate the right person to connect to. Usually it's at the First Nation government or the Indigenous group government level is a good place to start. But I will say that another good place to start is your Indigenous Tourism Association within your province. So what province are you in?
And Southwest Nova Scotia.
Right. So Insitin is your so Alex just shared it in the chat actually. So Insitin is the Nova Scotia I can't remember what the acronym actually stands for, but Robert Bernard is actually their executive director. So he would be a great person to start with to connect to the Mi'kmaq people. But to answer your bigger question, it is 100% you can engage with Métis communities, and that is Métis communities fall under the definition of Indigenous.
Okay.
So,
well, this village is, I would say, about 80% Métis. No one will admit to it in public. Kind of, they carry the card, but they're Acadian. So, it's like there are all these levels. But it probably would be more appropriate to go with the heritage, but they're not promoting it per se.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes all you can do is try to engage in those partnerships. And some First Nations or Indigenous groups are just not ready to engage in Indigenous tourism, but because they have other social issues and things like that. But try to make those right connections and do what you can, just making sure to not fill in the gaps yourself or
Yeah, no, I'm
yeah.
pretty sensitive otherwise.
Yeah, that's great. But Robert Bernard is definitely the person that you can look up, and so you can find his contact in the chat that Alex shared with, because he's the ED of Insiton, and that would be a great place to start to navigate those the Indigenous tourism associations in the provinces. More so than us at the national level, they really know who the operators are, and they know the Indigenous communities and the different connections within the Indigenous communities. So at a grassroots level, they can help you facilitate those partnerships.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Anybody else with any questions for Tara? Before we take off for the day? Tara, I just want to thank you so much for all the information you provided for us today. It was really informative. Thank you. I just want to remind everybody that at the end of the session, the little survey will pop up. If you could just take a second to fill it out, that would be great. And hope everybody has a great week.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for listening. If anyone would like to reach out, you can send my contact information out to everyone, I'm sure.
Yep.
Yeah, and if you want to know any more about the accreditation program, we're partnering with that. I know there's some economic development people here, and tourism like DMOs. Feel free to reach out at any time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Tara.